This is the first of the Mitzvah 4 classes, 4 shiurim related to Basi Legani. So what I'd like to do today in the very first class is to give a brief overview of the Maamar Basi Legani. What's the whole idea of the Maamar Basi Legani? And for that matter, I'm going to actually speak very generally about what a maamar is. What is a maamar? We're talking about the Maamar Basi Legani. What is a maamar?
Excuse me, Rabbi Deren, which year are we doing?
What year are we doing?
Yes, what year are we learning?
Wait, who's asking?
Lester, Yosef Chaim Lester.
Yeah, okay. So Yosef Chaim, we're going this year. You know what? I'll get to that in the overview. We'll
okay. I'll
get to that. Okay. Yeah. So this is in preparation for Yud Shvat. What is Yud Shvat? Yud Shvat is the day of the Istalkus, the passing of the Frierdiker Rebbe, number one. And it's also the day that the Rebbe assumed the position as the Rebbe of Lubavitch. A maamar is something that is said only by a Rebbe. It's a Torah that's said by a Rebbe. But it's also something unique. It's not just the fact that the Rebbe is saying a Torah. There's something very unique about a maamar. Now, honestly, it's very hard to describe what exactly is a maamar. The easiest way is by describing the circumstances in which a maamar is being said and the way it's being delivered. So there are a number of things, there may be 5 or 6 things that distinguish a maamar from something else that a Rebbe or any teacher may be giving over. First of all, going all the way back to the Alter Rebbe, who also would say maamarim. It's his means of conveying the Torah of Chassidus to the Chassidim and to those listening, right? And one of the things about a maamar is that a maamar always begins with either a pasuk in Tanakh or a maamar Chazal. Starts with a pasuk, okay? I mean, I should probably begin by saying that a maamar is Chassidus, okay? But to just say that a maamar is Chassidus does not truly, it does not really portray, it does not describe exactly what a maamar is, to just say it's Chassidus. Because you could open up a Sefer Tanya and learn a Perek from Tanya, and you're learning Chassidus, right? And it's not necessarily you'll be giving it over. You're giving over Chassidus. You're not giving over a maamar. As a matter of fact, Sefer Tanya, which was written by the Alter Rebbe, right, is not called a maamar. It's Chassidus, but it's not called a maamar. And yet, when a Rebbe says the maamar, everybody knows that now the Rebbe is saying a maamar. And for those who are not familiar, I mean, for someone who's familiar, this whole conversation is not even necessary. If you ever buy the Rebbe's Fabrengen, you know now the Rebbe is saying a maamar, right? But for those who have not had that experience, right? So let me just go through a number of things that distinguish a maamar from another, what would probably be more referred to as a sikha, for example, right? The Rebbe would speak for hours and hours and hours over the years, literally tens of thousands of hours of the Rebbe speaking, and generally it was sikhas. But there was also an occasion where the Rebbe would say a maamar. Okay, so a maamar definitely is something unique, something that stands apart. So let me go back to the first thing that I said, is that a maamar always begins with a pasuk, a maamar Chazal. Okay. Another thing about a maamar is that a maamar, when it is being said, it is said with a very unique tune. Okay. So if you listen to the sichos of the Rebbe and you become accustomed to the way the Rebbe speaks, the Rebbe had a certain kind of tune that he would use when he would speak. And when the Rebbe would say a maamar, there would be a different tune. Now, what's interesting is that there is such a thing called a maamar ke'ein sicha, right? Let me get into that a little bit later, but let me just stick with some of the descriptions of what the ordinary maamar would be, okay? Something else about a maamar is that before the maamar, generally, there would be a nigun, which is called the nigun hachana, a song that was sung in preparation for the maamar. Now, there were different songs that were used over the years by different Rabbeim. The one that was used by the Rebbe that I remembered, and for as long as I remember, was what's called the Nigun Rostov. The song would be sung, right? So when the Rebbe, in the middle of a Fabrengen, the Rebbe wanted to say a maamar, he was about to say a maamar, he would signal very subtly to Rabbi Elkan, it happened to be, that he's about to say a maamar, and he would start the song and everybody would sing the song. Okay? Is anybody counting? Okay, we've got three things. Begins with a pasuk or a maamar chazal. It's said in a special tune, right? There's a nigun that precedes the maamar. Okay? Another thing about a maamar, interestingly, is that while they're singing the song, so two things would happen. One, as far as the Rebbe is concerned, the Rebbe would very inconspicuously take out his handkerchief from his pocket, and he would, behind the table, wrap it around his hand. So the Rebbe would wrap this handkerchief around his hand, right, before the beginning of the maamar, and it would stay on his hand throughout the maamar. Also, during the nigun, everybody would stand up. That means at a Fabrengen, I'm sure you're familiar, you've seen pictures, right? So it was like stands, right? But in the middle, there were rows of table, and the older Chassidim would sit by the table, and generally the Bachim and the younger Chassidim would stand around, right? When the Rebbe would say a maamar, in the middle of this nigun, everybody would stand. Okay? Then the Rebbe would begin the maamar. And the last thing is that when the Rebbe would say a maamar, the Rebbe would say the maamar with his eyes closed. Okay? So you get a little bit of a picture. If you're not familiar, I'm thinking about you mostly, Michael, because I think maybe some. But this is, if you get an idea, you get a kind of an image of what exactly would happen by a maamar. And that's about the best you could do when it comes to describing what's a maamar. You actually know what a maamar is if you know what a maamar is, but it's hard to describe it. And the best thing you could do is just speak about all the things, the arum, as it's called in Yiddish, all the things, the circumstances around, as I just described. Was it 5 or 6 different things, right? Rabbi Silverman here mentioned there's such a thing called a maamar ke'ein sicha. A maamar ke'ein sicha would be that the Rebbe is actually saying a maamar, minus most of the things that I said, except for 2 things. Well, actually, only one thing really, the handkerchief. The Rebbe would take the handkerchief and would wrap around his hand. But he would then say the maamar, but he would say it as if he's speaking a regular sicha. So even when it comes to, for example, the pasuk that begins, right? When the Rebbe is saying a maamar in the regular, ordinary way of saying a maamar, he would begin with the pasuk. Basi Legani. If the Rebbe is saying the maamar as if it's a sicha, right? The Rebbe would say on the pasuk, right? And then you didn't really even know that it's going to be a maamar unless you were the Rebbe's brother-in-law, the Rashag, who sat at the side of the Rebbe, right? There was no nigun. Everybody remained seated. The Rebbe spoke like it's a sicha, right? But the Rashag, as he was referred to, would see that the Rebbe is taking out the handkerchief. When he saw the Rebbe taking out the handkerchief, he would stand. So the only one who would stand up for a maamar ke'ein sicha was the Rebbe's brother-in-law, the Rashag. He was the only one who would stand by a maamar ke'ein sicha. Anyway, that's what a maamar is. And maamarim have been said. By the way, the idea of a maamar ke'ein sicha was primarily something that was done by the Rebbe, right? Why sometimes we choose to say a maamar as a sicha, and rather than with the full blown, with all the trimmings as a regular maamar, I don't know. The idea of a maamar kein sicha, however, apparently exists before, because there is a reshima of the Rebbe, of the Frierdiker Rebbe. I don't know if the Frierdiker Rebbe ever would say a maamar in that form, in that way, but there is a reshima, there are notes of the Frierdiker Rebbe concerning a maamar that the Rebbe Rashab had said one year, I think it was Samach Vav in Lubavitch, right? And he writes on the heading, he wrote the notes of the maamar that the Rebbe Rashab had said, and he says that the maamar ne'emar ke'ein sicha, this was a maamar that was said as a sicha. And indeed, that maamar from that year of Simchas Torah was actually originally printed in Torah's Shalom, which is the sichas of the Rebbe Rashab, and later, at the end of Tafrev of the Sefer Samach Vav, it was printed as a maamar from the Hanacha of the Frierdiker. Okay. Anyway, on Yud Shvat, in the year Tavshin Yud, 1950, in preparation for Shabbos, Yud Shvat, that year Yud Shvat was on the Shabbos, a maamar from the Frierdiker Rebbe was published. And that maamar is the famous classical maamar, the maamar Basi Legani. Okay. Now, the Frierdiker Rebbe was not saying maamarim at the time. Okay. This particular maamar of Basi Legani was actually perhaps said by the Frierdiker Rebbe, but years before, in the Tzaddiks, I think Tzaddik Gibel and Tzaddik Dalit, if I'm not mistaken. And it may have been written because the Frierdiker Rebbe would write up many of his maamarim. Is that correct, everyone? Yeah. And the Rebbe, in his position, I'm sorry, the Dibar HaMaskal. It could be there wasn't the Dibar HaMaskal, but the maamar was from Tzaddik Dalit, maybe. The Rebbe, in his position as appointed by the Frierdiker Rebbe to be the head of Merkaz L'Inyanei Chinuch, which also included the publishing of the works of Chassidus, of all the Rabbeim, including the Frierdiker Rebbe, something that the Rebbe was involved in even before he was officially appointed, going back to Leningrad, and later when the Frierdiker Rebbe was in Riga, in Latvia, and later in Poland, the Rebbe was very involved in publishing the sichas and the maamarim of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So in America, that was something that also took place. And for this Shabbos, that Yud Shvat happens to be the yahrzeit of the Frierdiker Rebbe's grandmother, the Rebbetzin Rivka, of the Rebbe of the Rebbe Marash, the Frierdiker Rebbe's grandfather. And then 3 days later on Yud Gimel Shvat is the yahrzeit of Rebbetzin Steiner Sora, the Frierdiker Rebbe's mother, right? So the Rebbe, in his position, right, had prepared for publication this maamar of Basi Legani. It was a very long maamar of 20 chapters. So the way it was prepared for publication was that it was to be done in 4 installments. The first installment, the first 5 chapters, were to be published in honor of Yud Shvat. The next 5 chapters for Yud Gimel Shvat, and subsequently, on that day, it turned out that it was the Histalkus, it was the passing of the Frierdiker Rebbe. Nonetheless, following, the rest of the maamar was published, then for Purim, and then for Beis Nisan, which is the passing of the Rebbe Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe's father. So the maamar was published in full, right? I think in English there's a word posthumously. So I guess the first installment was not really posthumously; it was before. But the next 15 chapters, or the 3 installments, happened afterwards.
Was it 4 different maamarim?
It's all one maamar. It's one hemshech. It's called a hemshech. Well, so interestingly, when the Rebbe would prepare the maamarim, especially this maamar, which was really a maamar that the Frierdiker Rebbe had said years before, but had never been published, right? So when the Rebbe would publish it, the Rebbe would give it into the Frierdiker Rebbe to add in a heading and an ending, okay, which was something very common with them, maamarim of Samach Vav, okay, with a heading and an ending. So the first maamar, the Frierdiker Rebbe put in the heading and the ending, right? That is, well, okay, and then the second maamar, that I'm not sure exactly if that was correct what I just said, but the second maamar, Yosef Beganim, again begins with a pasuk, right? And that was also already prepared before Yud Shvat. This last two installments, in other words, the last 10 OCS, right, chapters, do not have a beginning and an end.
What's the connection between those different Moscows and the actual part of the Maamar?
There's no, the Maamar is connected. The Maamar, the Teichen of the Maamar. Well, yeah, that's one of the interesting things. Sometimes you don't see the connection, especially in Samach Vav, for example, where all the Maamar of the Rebbe Rashab. Very often, it's very hard to see exactly what the connection between the heading and the ending is, right? Because it starts with the heading, and he says, in order to understand this, we have to go back to what we started discussing a year ago, and I haven't finished yet, right? There was some Sheikhim that went on for more than a year, for like 2.5 years, if I'm not mistaken, right? So I think the longest Hemshech, I believe, was maybe 2.5 years. And that over that's all. It's technically all on Maamar, right? And when it's published, they put in a heading. Maybe, perhaps, yeah. Okay, so this was the Maamar. Being that Al Pi Hashgacha Pratis, that was also the day of the passing of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So subsequently, actually, I guess it came to light mostly the following year at the first anniversary of Yud Shvat. The Rebbe connected this Maamar to the passing of the Frierdiker Rebbe, right? And he connected it especially to the day of Yud Shvat. And there's a famous letter that the Rebbe wrote on Rosh Chodesh Shvat before the first anniversary of the passing. One of the things in the letter is that on the day of Yud Shvat, to learn the Maamar that was published by the Frierdiker Rebbe in honor of Yud Shvat the year before. Okay.
Like a will?
Well, the Rebbe also referred to it as like this. Well, I mean, there's many sichos that the Rebbe connects the Maamar to Yud Shvat and to, in general, our whole avodah of the Dor HaShvi, right? The seventh generation from the Alter Rebbe. Obviously, yes. The Rebbe made that point, over and over. Okay, especially in that letter. I mean, the first time is probably in that letter where the Rebbe specifically instructed that the Maamar be learned. Okay, so every Yud Shvat, we learn the Maamar. What happened on that Yud Shvat, though, there was a Farbrengen that the Rebbe participated in, which was not something unique, right? But I must mention that for that year, the Rebbe was very reluctant to officially assume the position of being the Rebbe, okay? Being that the Rebbe did not officially accept that position, the Rebbe would Farbrengen even during the lifetime of the Frierdiker Rebbe, going all the way back to the early 1930s, okay? There's a record of a Farbrengen, I think from Hatzvi-Bais, maybe 1932, or it would actually be 1931, where the Rebbe was in. No, the Frierdiker was not in Akrotsk yet in Tzaddik Aleph. It was in Akrotsk. Whatever, I might have my dates a little off, but in any case, when the Frierdiker Rebbe settled in Akrotsk, and the Rebbe was there for Yom Tov, and the Frierdiker Rebbe instructed him to Farbrengen for the yeshiva, for the Talmidei yeshiva, and there is a record of that. I think, yeah, perhaps it was also this in Atkotsk, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, this is being all recorded. So if anything I'm saying wrong, you could be sure somebody will notice. Yeah, I believe it's being recorded. Right? Okay, so we'll get the corrections. We'll get a follow up of all the corrections. Yeah, when it comes to the date. Anyway. What happened at that Fabrik? Now, I have to mention that the Rebbe was functioning as a Rebbe, and as far as the Chassidim were concerned, the Rebbe was a Rebbe. Okay, I'm getting a little bit off the Maamar. This is turning into like a Farbrengen, but I hope nobody minds. But I will say, I mean, the Rebbe functioned as a Rebbe all along, and the famous letter to Rabbi Posner, where Rabbi Posner was already here in Pittsburgh as a shliach of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And shortly after Yud Shvat, the passing of the Frierdiker Rebbe, apparently Rabbi Posner had written a letter to the Rebbe saying, What do you mean you're not going to be mikabel the Messias? You're not going to accept upon yourself the leadership. I'm here out in the field. I was sent there by the Frierdiker Rebbe. I don't do anything without his guidance. And if I have any questions, I ask him, right? Yeah, you can't leave me hanging like this. You have to be. It's almost like, I'm sorry, you have no choice. You got to be Rebbe, right? And this is where the Rebbe answered him at the bottom of a general letter. Yishla she'la, and he should write whatever issues he has. He should write them to the shiurim, to the grave, to the burial place of the Frierdiker Rebbe. When I have actually the actual writing, the handwriting of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he runs out of space and goes up the side. For him. Certainly, he will find a way how to answer you. So basically, the Rebbe was for 12 months avoiding the pressure, right? And he always seemed to find a way around. Okay. Except for certain individuals. I heard a story that one of the Hechts, I think it was the father of the Hecht brother, famous Hecht brothers, went in with a pigeon, which is something you only give to a Rebbe. And the Rebbe says, "Why are you giving it to me? Why don't you go to the tzir and go, right?" And apparently the Hechts have a certain nature, right? And he's maybe whatever. And he told the Rebbe very boldly. He said, "Rebbe, I'm not here for an address. I am here for a bracha or for an eitzah, right?" And it's from, I believe what happened is that the Rebbe, accepted that. But I think maybe put on his gadol and he took the pigeon, right? But for that you need the chutzpah. Okay. But in any case, at this Farbrengen that took place on Yud Shvat, right? There was a lot of anticipation. Chassidim thought that this would be the moment, right? They even announced it in the newspapers. The Rebbe was upset about that. He called in some Chassidim and he wanted to know, who's behind that. But the bottom line is at this Farbrengen, the Rebbe started saying a Maamar. There's a tape of it. You can hear it. And what was the Maamar? The Rebbe started reviewing the Maamar that was published by the Frierdiker Rebbe the previous year on Yud Shvat, Basi Legani. Basi Legani, and the Rebbe started saying the Maamar. And you can imagine the emotions that the Rebbe himself got very emotional. The couple times the Rebbe broke down crying in the middle of this Maamar. At the end of the Maamar, there was a chassid that jumped up on the table. Debtzov was his name. He jumped up on the table and he made a shechionu, a bracha shechionu b'shem Malchus Baruch Atah with Hashem, right? And shechionu became up. And instantly the sichos, and now we're going back to sichos. The Farbrengen didn't end, and the sichos was basically a mission statement by the Rebbe. He called it a mission statement, I think, or something of that sort, right? And it was basically, they said, "Okay, guys, you win. This is it." And then the rest is history, or the rest is still unfolding. It's still unfolding as well. Okay. In that Maamar that the Rebbe said, Basi Legani and Tavshin Yud Aleph, 1951, like I said, he began to review the Maamar, and then he elaborated on something on a point that the Frierdiker Rebbe makes in the first chapter of that Maamar. The following year, now in between, there were other Farbrengens, of course. The Rebbe always would Farbrengen Shabbos Avarchim. That goes back even before. And often there would be a Maamar, not always. Never really knew exactly when there will be a Maamar or not. There were times you could expect, there was a high chance that there will be a Maamar, but you never knew 100% for sure. And 12 months later, now it's 1952, Tavshin Yud-Bais, at the Farbrengen on Yud Shvat, the Rebbe again says a Maamar, Basi Legani, starting Basi Legani, and this time he's reviewing the Maamar until he gets to chapter 2. And chapter 2, the Rebbe elaborates on a point that the Frierdiker Rebbe makes in chapter 2. And this continued, now there's 20 chapters to this Maamar. This continued for 20 years until the year Tavshin Lamed, 1970. Every year, the Rebbe on Yud Shvat at the Great Farbrengen, the Rebbe would say a Maamar. The Maamar would begin Basi Legani. He would review the Maamar up until the chapter of that year, and then he would then elucidate, and he would. By the way, something that I should have mentioned when I was talking about a Maamar in general, because I think this is important. One of the Chassidim would say that when the Rebbe is saying a Maamar, it's Shechina medaberes mitoich groinoi. It's like the Shechina is speaking through his throat. This is a term that's used in the Medrash in reference to Moshe Rabbeinu. When Hashem said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, we heard it coming from Moshe, but it was the Shechina speaking through Moshe. This explains the eyes closed, I guess. And this also explains the handkerchief. I heard from my grandfather, Rabbi Posner, an explanation about the handkerchief, and it goes back to when the Alter Rebbe was a Talmud of the Mezritcher Maggid. And when the Mezritcher Maggid would say a Torah, and they didn't refer to it as a Maamar, I don't believe. So most of the Talmidim, they would get into such a state of hispirus that they couldn't concentrate. They would lose themselves, right? Except for the Alter Rebbe and a much older Talmud, Rabbi Nachum Mendel Horodoker, right? Well, actually, the Alter Rebbe looked up to. He actually, after the passing of Mezritcher Maggid, the Alter Rebbe considered himself to be a chassid of Nachum Mendel Horodoker until he moved to Eretz Yosef. They would hold on tight to each other, right? Literally, just physically hold on to each other, and in that way, the two of them were able to maintain, the proper mental state to hear the Torah of the Mezritcher Maggid till the very end. This is Gilui Elokus happening, literally Gilui Elokus. So something that Chassidim just take, this is their understanding of what's happening when a Rebbe says a Maamar, is that you are hearing revelation of godliness. Okay, all of Torah is revelation of godliness. But when we sit down and we give a shiur and whatever, and we're learning Torah, that's our struggle to try to grasp and to connect, to the Torah. It's what's called milmatu lamayla, right? We're learning Torah, we struggle, we've tried to figure out, we come up with brilliant ideas, and you could be a great Rosh Hashiva and say wonderful, beautiful shiurim. These are all attempts how a human being with a human mind is attempting to attach his intellect, right, with the chachma, with the intellect of the Torah. But then there's what's called a nevuah. A nevuah is a revelation that you're not struggling. You have to just put yourself aside, and Navi has to completely be absolutely bottled, and then the Shechina, right, just speaks through it, right? So it's not a human attempt to try to grasp onto godliness. It's godliness revealing itself to the human being. In the case of a Navi, through a Navi. This is how Chassidim would consider a Maamar. A Maamar is Shechina medaberes mitoich. Okay. So I guess if you're going to say what a Maamar actually is, rather than speak about all the trimmings, you'd have to take a very bold stance and say, listen, bottom line, what's a Maamar? A Maamar is like Anochi Hashem Elokecha on Matan Torah. Hashem revealed himself, right? Hashem is now revealing himself through the Rebbe saying the Maamar. Okay. Well, whatever. That's a whole different discussion. Okay, that's a different thing. Okay, so the Rebbe says the Maamar Basi Legani. Okay, and then every year subsequently, the Rebbe would say a Maamar on the chapter of that year. This all came to a pinnacle 20 years later, Tavshin Lamed, 1970. I was here in 8th grade here in Yeshiva Chet Amimim. Rabbi Posner, together with 3 other kids here in Yeshiva, he took us actually on a plane. We flew for Yud Shvat, and I don't want to spend the rest of the time because I can very easily spend the rest of the time just speaking about it. But what was unique, there was such a high level of anticipation because now the Rebbe is going to be saying Basi Legani, and it's on the last chapter. So this is like the end of an era, coupled with the fact that the Frierdiker Rebbe had begun the writing of a Sefer Torah that he wanted everyone to participate in, right? And it was referred to, and he said that with this Sefer Torah, we will go and greet Mashiach Tzidkenu. and subsequently it was referred to as Mashiach Sacred Day. After Yud Shvat, it was shelved. The project was put on hold. Sometime before Yud Shvat Tovshin Lamed, the Rebbe said he wants it to be finished by Yud Shvat of that year. Wow. You can imagine the anticipation. I mean, I had older siblings already in New York, in Yeshiva and Beisirka, right? And I remember them calling my parents for something that was not a common thing in those days, to make a long distance phone call, maybe twice a year or something, right? And I remember them calling and telling my parents that they have to bring all the kids because this is it. This Yud Shvat Mashiach is definitely coming. There's no question about it. That is the background to Basi Legani and its connection to Yud Shvat. Mashiach certainly came, but not the way we wanted him to come, right? He has his own ideas of how exactly it's all going to play out. And the next year, Tavshin Lamed Aleph, the Rebbe started all over again, right? So from Tavshin Lamed Aleph until Tavshin Nun, we have another cycle of the Rebbe saying maamarim on Yud Shvat, beginning with Basi Legani, reviewing the maamar up until the chapter of that year, right? And until you come to Tavshin Nun. And then we have another two maamarim of Nun Aleph and Nun Beis, and unfortunately, after that, we don't have any more maamarim. This year is from Tavshin Yud to Pei Beis is how many years? 72 years, right? So that's 3 cycles plus 12. So this year it was customary that each year we have the original maamar of the Frierdiker Rebbe, obviously. So we're holding a chapter Yud Beis, and we have 2 maamarim from the Rebbe in the year Tavshin Chaf Beis, 1962, and then another maamar from the Rebbe in Tavshin Mem Beis, 20 years later, right? So that's what the Chassidim have, and that's what we generally do in preparation for Yud Shvat. We kochzak, so to speak. We kochzak in these maamarim. So what I'm going to do for the rest of today's class, really, probably, the best thing to do is to actually learn the Frierdiker Rebbe's maamar, right? Get all the way to chapter 12 at least, right? You can't do that. Minimum, learn chapter 12, right? And then learn the Rebbe's maamarim, the 2 maamarim in this case that he said in the first cycle, 12 years later, and in the second cycle, 32 years after the passing. Okay. What I'm going to do, though, is because when the Rebbe says his maamar, what does the Rebbe do? The Rebbe gives a summary and a synopsis of the maamar of the Frierdiker Rebbe up until that chapter. So what we'll do is as follows. We will learn the first ois. That's what we'll do for the rest of this class on page Tes. It's actually the first 2 paragraphs, which is it's numbered as chapter 1, chapter Aleph. Yeah. So we're going to learn the Rebbe because in the process of learning what the Rebbe said that year, right? Before he got to Yud Beis, he gave a summary, a synopsis of the maamar up until that chapter. So in this way, we will get the Rebbe's summary rather than go learn 11 chapters up until the chapter 12, right? We will learn the Rebbe's maamar, where the Rebbe gives us a summary, right, in 2 chapters up until that place. And then, if you look in Ois Beis, the Rebbe says, and now we're going to focus on what the Frierdiker Rebbe says in chapter 12, and then the rest of that maamar that year was basically the Rebbe elaborating on something in chapter 12. So we're going to get the summary first. After we get the summary, in Mitzvah next week, what we'll do is because we have the lead up until chapter 12, next week we're going to learn chapter 12 from the Frierdiker Rebbe's maamar. And then, in Mitzvah, we will continue in the Rebbe's maamar. Okay, I thought that would be the best way to structure this, right? So I think because you get, okay, every year basically, that's what Basi Legani, from beginning up until the chapter. Well, he doesn't really review actually the whole Maamar, but he goes in summary and point by point. Well, you'll see. We're gonna get a summary of 11 chapters right now. Okay, right now. Okay, so let's turn to page Tes and the Rebbe, the Maamar of the Rebbe from Hatzvi-Bais. So again, it starts. Oh, by the way, Basi Legani is a pasuk in shiurim, by the way. Okay, which Chassidim, in Lubavitch, we don't have the custom to say Shir Hashir. Most of the world, they say Shir Hashir. The Sfardim, there's not a Sfardi that doesn't know the whole Shir Hashirim word for word by heart. Okay? Shir Hashirim is very beautiful. I've spent many Shabbos together with Sfardim, right? And I envied them, that they would they just rattle, Friday night before Kabbalah Shabbos, the whole Shir Hashirim, word for word, beginning to end, right? Without even looking inside the Siddur. And I envy them. It's very beautiful. But if you learn Chassidus, right, you are going to be very familiar with many, many, many psukim of Shir Hashirim. Okay? You can't rattle off the whole thing, but there are many tens of different sentences, psukim from Shir Hashirim that are very familiar to us, because there are so many maamarim. As a matter of fact, in the maamarim of the Alter Rebbe, when the maamarim were printed, right? The Tzabach Tzedek printed the maamarim of the Alter Rebbe in 2 volumes, Torah and Lakuti Torah. There's a whole section just for Shir Hashirim, right? The whole thing is basically on the parshas of Torah. There's no section for anything else in Tanakh, but there is for Shir Hashirim. Okay, so this is a pasuk, and there are many maamarim before this maamar from the Frierdiker Rebbe, right? On the pasuk of Basi Legani. Basi Legani Achaisi Kalo. So this pasuk from Shir Hashirim, which is basically a conversation between Hashem and Knesset Yisrael and the Jewish people, right? Based metaphorically on the relationship between a husband and a wife, right? So Hashem is constantly referring to Bnei Yisrael as his bride, right? And other terms in Shir Hashirim, right? And in this pasuk, Hashem is speaking to Knesset Yisrael, and he says, Basi Legani, I have come to my garden, Achoisi Kala, oh my beloved. Achoisi literally means my sister, but it's also a term that could just mean my beloved, Kala, my beloved bride. Baldi Lula says the Rebbe that the Frierdiker Rebbe says in his Maamar, Al Yisoid Maamar HaMedrash, based on a Medrash. The Frierdiker Rebbe's Maamar actually begins with this Medrash. And the Medrash is speaking about this pasuk. And it says, Legani, I came to my garden, says the Medrash, Leganuni. Hashem is telling Knesset Yisrael, I'm coming to my place that's already mine. It's already established as mine. What does that mean? Because I'm only coming back to where I originally was. And then the Medrash goes on. Because when Hashem created the world, he created the world in a manner that his presence was there. That's the basic narrative of Bereshis, right? That Hashem, there was Gan Eden, and Gan Eden was here in this physical world, right? Meaning that in this physical world, there was a presence of Hashem, the presence of the Shekhinah. But then the Medrash goes on to say, then, because of unfortunate things that happened, the Shekhinah was rejected, pushed away from this world. And the way it's described in the Medrash is that it was pushed away in stages. Okay? And we know that there's this idea that the heavens, there are 7 heavens, right? It happens to be. I mean, if you learn the Rambam, you understand that these are the Galgalim, and it's actual 7 different cycles that you could observe up in the heavens. But obviously, it's also a reference to something spiritually as well. In this case, the Medrash doesn't mean that he was shut up to this what's it called, the galgal of the moon, or the galgal of the sun, or whatever. It means he was removed, his presence through the Chatoim, he was removed from this world. But then, there began a process, starting with Avram Avinu, of bringing the Shekhinah back to this world. Ad Moshe Rabbeinu, until Moshe Rabbeinu, Roya Ne'eman shel Kol Yisrael, who was the faithful shepherd of all the Yidden, which I don't think is mentioned in the Friedrich Rebbe's Maamar. The Rebbe is adding this in, by the way. Shehu Hashvi, he was the seventh, starting from Avraham Avinu. B'chol Hashvi and Chabibin, and we have from other sources that there's something very special about seven, that there's other sources which enumerate all the different people who were seven, right? And they stood out as being Chabibin. They were special. So Moshe Rabbeinu, the seventh, in the process of bringing the Shekhinah back to this world, right? He was the one who brought finally back from the closest stage, but not yet in this world, right? That would be the first Rekiah, seventh Rekiah being the furthest. From the first Rekiah, he was the one who finally brought it back to this world. Which, by the way, what is the Medrash referencing? Referencing the fact that Matan Torah happened through Moshe Rabbeinu. What was Matan Torah? Matan Torah, says the Medrash, is what the Basi Legani is talking about. When I came to you and I brought you the luch, I gave you the Torah, right? And the luchas and the Hadibres, right? That was me coming back to where I originally was. Matan Torah. So because at that moment, at Matan Torah, basically that began a whole new process of now engaging in bringing the Shekhinah here to this world and keeping the Shekhinah here on this world, which is through the Torah mitzvahs that were given to us at Matan Torah. So that's what Matan Torah did. It started a process, the process of Hashem having a dwelling place here in this world. Okay. Again, this is all coming from many different sources. Okay. It doesn't say this in the Medrash on the Pasuk Basi Legani, but there are other Medrashim that say that one of the purposes that Hashem created the world was that he had a dira b'tachtainim. He had a place where he could feel comfortable in the physical world, right? When did that process begin? It began by Matan Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu brought the Shekhinah back to its original place. I'm sorry, what?
And then they need the faith also.
Can they?
Yeah. So it didn't start really. My daughter started.
Well, yeah, but that then it was removed, and well, yeah, by bringing the Shekhinah back, right? You in a sense you could say metaphorically you're bringing Gan Eden back to this world. Okay, well, because what is Gan Eden? Gan Eden is the presence of Hashem. Okay, the difference is that Gan Eden was done by Hashem. When Hashem does things, He does it. Boom! It's all the way, right? The process that began at Matan Torah, I mean, that was a milestone, obviously, because now this world is a place that is now a keli. It's a place where the Shekhinah can actually coexist with this world, right? But it's a process. It's the beginning of a process, okay? And so much so that even after Matan Torah, we see miyad la'achei hamshachas hashchina merkia alef la'aretz. What was the first thing that Moshe Rabbeinu engaged in after Matan Torah and after he had spent, the time up on the mountain until Yom Kippur? The day after Yom Kippur, he began the mitzvah of what? And you should make for me a sanctuary so that I may rest amongst them, right? The Shekhinah, that was what had to happen in order to get this process moving along its steps. Okay. And concerning the Mishkan, which is also, by the way, includes the Mikdash, we find that the Mikdash is also referenced as the Mishkan. And likewise, the Mishkan is referenced at times like the Mikdash. Nemar, one of the things that it says about the building of the Beis HaMikdash, Vasisas HaKaroshim LeMishkan Atzei Shipim Haigim. One of the details was that it had to be with boards of Atzei Shipim, certain kind of wood. So the Friedrich Rebbe in his Maamar, he explains that if you look at that mitzvah, which was the beginning, right, which was solidifying the process, beginning this solidifying of the process of making a dira b'tachtainim, if you look carefully, you'll get some very, very deep insights as to what this avodah, what is this service, what does it entail? Okay. The keresh, the board, basically represents what kind of an avodah we are going to do that will enhance and advance this process. So let's focus on the fact that there were atzei shitim. Why shitim? Because the word shitim has to do with a Hebrew word called shtus, which is shtus de kedusha. Okay? Now you're chuckling because shtus normally is used in the negative, right? But the Friedrich Rabbi makes the exact point that what is, well, I'll read it inside. What is shtus in the regular, the way your mother used to tell you, right? She means you're doing something that makes no sense. You're being silly, right? Makes no sense. Well, that's in the negative. But in the realm of holiness, in Kedusha, what is shtus? Shtus means that you're doing something that doesn't necessarily have to be explained sensibly. Doesn't have to be 100% rational. Right? And why specifically that avodah? Because what is it? What's this process? This process is that we have this world. This world is full of all kinds of shtus, right? Things that don't make sense, right? As a matter of fact, as the Chazal say, the only way that a person could possibly do an Aveda is because he was overcome by shtus, right? Meaning some temporary insanity, right? So the way to combat it, right, is by what? Is the Avodah of Kedusha. But for the Avodah of Kedusha to combat shtus, it has to be the kind of avodah which is the antidote, right? Which is shtus de kedusha, doing things in the holy realm, but also don't necessarily. You think you're crazy? Let me show you what's crazy, right? and you redirect the craziness, so to speak, right, in a positive way. That describes in a nutshell the whole process of making this world a dwelling place for Hashem. Okay. If you're familiar with the Maamar of the Friedrich Rebbe, you see how the Rebbe right now is already holding up to like chapter 3 of the Friedrich Rebbe's Maamar. Okay. This Avodah, who does it in this world? The Jews are the ones who are chosen for that service. If we're becoming Medrash, it's dafke b'nei Yisrael, by them doing Torah mitzvahs, do they have this effect. And interestingly, this is why the Jews, one of the titles that are used for b'nei Yisrael is that they are Tzivos Hashem, legions of Hashem, army of Hashem. Okay? Miloshin Tzava means an army. Sheyesh begimul perushim. Actually, and this is from the Maamar of the Friedrich Rebbe, there's three interpretations for the word Tzava. Tzava Miloshin Anshechayil, it means simply, the most common way it's used is that it means soldiers. Sheyisrael him Anshechayil. We are the soldiers. Hashem has his design. He has his desire, right? He has his soldiers. We'll see it through. Okay. How? By our continuing the Matan Torah, right? And continuing the process of bringing the Shekhinah here. By our doing things, not necessarily the most conventional way, but shtus de kedusha. Tzva miloshin zman mugdal. Tzva also means a designated amount of time. V'shikosu, like it says, a pasuk in Yiur, hali tzva le'neish ali aretz. A man only has a certain amount of given time here on this world. What's the point that the Friedrich Rebbe wants to bring out? This tells us how that avodah has to take place. We are doing all of this avodah, right? We might be doing it with we approach it with perhaps with a little shtus, right? A little craziness, but it's being done within what's called zman umakim. It's within the restraints of time and place. Okay, because as crazy as things get, you have to always remember, it has to be done within halacha, because otherwise you're not doing Torah mitzvahs, right? And halacha is very, very particular when it comes to zman and makim. Okay, two major factors in almost every halacha that you can think of. Then you have tzava lashin sivya b'yof. It stands out in its beauty. And again, this is another metaphorical way of describing how we go about this process of making the dira b'tachtainim. It has to be done, first of all, as a soldier. Second of all, understanding that it has to be done orderly. And third, it has to be done with what's called hiskaludos. How should I describe that? With a sense of of inclusion. Okay. In other words, if you're going to go through this process egotistically, it's not going to work. Okay. It has to be something that's beautiful because it includes everything, right? Someone pointed out to me something that the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, right? That in Hatzvi-Bais of Geras HaKodesh, that Kol Echad Misukan Mechaver says, when does a person become complete? You cannot become complete on your own. You can only become complete Misukan al Yidei Chaver through your friend, right? Because no person has everything, right? And the way for things to be done properly and to be complete and whole is if you understand what you're lacking and you allow the other person to influence you, right? My vision of Mashiach. When Mashiach comes, everybody's going to be exactly what they are, right? If you're a chassid, you'll be a chassid. If you're a litvak, you'll be a litvak. If you're a belzer, you'll be a belzer. Whatever you are, right? Whatever you are. Everyone has something beautiful. When Mashiach will come, everybody's going to recognize the beauty of the other person. So everyone's going to try to incorporate, they're going to stay who they are, but they're also going to incorporate the beauty of everybody else, okay? We just happen to have the most thought. So most people will be absorbing.
Like everybody else.
I have to be, what can I do? I was brought up very partisan, okay? But that's the idea. So I think that's what it means here, that tzva is the beauty, the hiskalos, right? Okay. That's avodah could only be done that way. Everybody together, right? It's a joint effort, so to speak. And this is how we're going to complete the process of making a holy resting place for Hashem, Shechina, to reside. As it's being carried out through Bnei Yisrael here down in this world. Okay. We have 5 minutes to finish the next chapter. 1 minute and you 1 minute? At the end. Oh, you want to say something at the end? Okay. Yeah, so I don't know. What? Yeah, okay, fine, you're right. It's okay. So in the next paragraph, again, the Rebbe is going to continue the synopsis, the summary. He's going to basically focus on identifying what the message of the Frierdiker Rebbe in the first 2 maamarim, so that means the first 10 chapters. Okay, so that's what the Rebbe is going to address at the beginning of the next paragraph, right? And then he's going to mention what the Frierdiker Rebbe says in chapter 11, right? And that leads in to chapter 12, okay? So the next paragraph is basically going to be, okay, what happens after the first 10, okay? After that first 2 maamarim, right? He establishes a certain idea of what Avodas Hashem is all about, right? It's about doing what's called the Rebbe doesn't mention it there this time, but the iskafia, the ishapcha, right? By resisting, the temptations of the Yitzchok, etc., etc. And the way to do it is with the shtus de kedusha. You have to like completely combat him on his own, on his terms, so to speak. Well, on your terms, but enough to combat the mishagas of the Lumaza, right? And that basically that's the idea of Basi Legani. And the Mitzvah Hashem, next week we will continue in the next chapter. And here the Frierdiker Rebbe goes into some very amazing ideas about what's the motivation behind it, both from Hashem's perspective, right? And how it is so deeply, deeply rooted in the very essence of Hashem, right? And how that touches and requires the essence of the Jew, okay? And this will be a Mitzvah Hashem, where we will pick it up next week, same time, same place.
Thank you.
Baruch Rabbi.